The sound that came from my brother's girlfriend's mouth wasn't laughter. It was something sharper, meaner, designed to cut. Oh, please, Marcus. Don't tell me your toilet scrubbing sister thinks she belongs at the country club dinner. The entire 4th of July barbecue went silent. 37 people, including my parents, just stood there as Vanessa Pierce delivered that line with surgical precision. But here's what she didn't know. What none of them knew was that 3 days earlier, I'd been personally invited by David Kellerman, CEO of Apex Industries, to join their board of directors. A position worth more than their entire hardware store had made in the last decade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Mitchell, and I've spent the last 5 years of my life living a lie so perfectly crafted that even I sometimes forgot the truth. Have you ever hidden your success so completely that when it finally surfaced, it felt like watching a stranger's life unfold? That's exactly what happened when my carefully constructed world of deception collided with a woman who thought she knew my worth, based on what she assumed I did for 40 hours a week. The barbecue was supposed to be a celebration. Marcus had just proposed to Vanessa the week before, and Mom insisted we all gather at the old house on Maple Street to toast their engagement. I'd driven up from Portland that morning, my Tesla parked strategically around the corner, because in Riverside, Oregon, success was supposed to be humble, quiet, invisible. My family believed I worked in building maintenance, a story I'd maintained since graduating from Stanford with my MBA. Not because I was ashamed of cleaning, but because I'd learned early that my achievements made them uncomfortable in ways they'd never admit out loud. Vanessa had moved to Riverside 6 months ago, swept Marcus off his feet with her perfectly curated Instagram presence and her daddy's real estate connections. She carried herself like someone who'd never doubted her place in any room, which made her assumption about my place even more cutting. When she looked at me, she saw someone in worn jeans and a simple cotton shirt, someone who arrived alone and left early, someone who never talked about work or money or ambitions. She saw exactly what I'd trained everyone to see. The country club dinner she was referring to was the Riverside Chamber of Commerce annual gala, a stuffy affair where local business owners gathered to pat themselves on the back and network over overpriced salmon. Marcus and Vanessa had been planning to attend for weeks, treating it like some sort of social debut. The idea that I might have any business being there struck her as genuinely absurd, and she wasn't shy about sharing that observation with our entire extended family. What made her comment particularly brutal wasn't just the public humiliation, it was the casual cruelty of it. She didn't know me well enough to dislike me for any real reason. This was pure social positioning, establishing herself as the successful one, the one who belonged, while relegating me to the bottom of whatever hierarchy existed in her mind. My parents said nothing. Marcus looked uncomfortable but stayed silent. My 8-year-old niece Emma tugged on my shirt and whispered, "Aunt Jess, why is she being mean?" That's when something crystallized inside me, sharp and clear as broken glass. I'd spent years protecting my family from the complexity of my real life, letting them believe I was the simple one, the one who hadn't quite figured it out, the one who needed their gentle concern, and occasional $20 bills slipped into my hand at Christmas. I'd convinced myself this was kindness, that letting them feel successful and important was worth my own invisibility. But standing there, watching Vanessa Pierce use me as a stepping stone to elevate herself in front of people I'd loved and protected for years, I realized my silence hadn't been protecting them at all. It had been enabling them to become the kind of people who would let someone speak to their daughter, their sister, like that. The barbecue continued around us, conversations resuming with that forced brightness people use when they're pretending something ugly hasn't just happened. Dad started talking loudly about the Mariners' chances this season. Mom busied herself rearranging the potato salad. Marcus wrapped his arm around Vanessa's waist like she'd done something clever rather than something cruel. And I stood there, holding my paper plate of half-eaten corn on the cob, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, the burning desire to show someone exactly who they were dealing with. But I didn't explode. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even correct her assumption. Instead, I did something that would have surprised anyone who really knew me. I smiled, set down my plate, and said the 4 words that would change everything. "You're absolutely right, Vanessa." Then I walked to my car, drove back to Portland, and made a phone call that had been waiting 5 years to happen. Tyler Brooks, my assistant at Wellington Consulting Group, answered on the second ring. "Jess, I thought you were at the family thing today." Tyler had been fielding my family calls for years, trained to say I was in meetings or out on site visits whenever anyone from Riverside called the office. He knew the whole story, had even helped me craft the building maintenance cover by setting up a fake company website and business cards, complete with a downtown Portland address that was actually just a P.O. box. "Change of plans," I told him, pulling into my parking garage downtown. "Remember that Apex Industries board invitation? The one David Kellerman extended personally? I need you to call his office first thing Monday morning and tell them I'm accepting." There was a pause. Tyler knew this wasn't just about career advancement. Joining the Apex board would make my appointment public record, featured in the business journals, announced in press releases. There would be no more hiding, no more careful stories about maintenance schedules and building inspections. "Are you sure you're ready for that level of visibility?" he asked gently. "Once this goes public, there's no going back to the low-profile thing." I looked up at my building, at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my loft apartment that overlooked the river, at the life I'd built in complete secrecy because I thought I was protecting people who had just stood by and watched someone humiliate me for sport. "Tyler," I said, "I've been ready for 5 years. I just forgot that being invisible isn't the same as being protected." That night, I did something I'd never allowed myself to do before. I opened my laptop and looked at my real life like a stranger might see it. Jessica Mitchell, Senior Strategy Consultant, Wellington Consulting Group. Stanford MBA, summa cum laude, specialization in corporate restructuring and market expansion. Client list that read like a Fortune 500 directory. Personal net worth that, conservatively calculated, put me in the top 5% of earners in Oregon. Awards, speaking engagements, published articles on business transformation that had been cited in Harvard Business Review. This was the person Vanessa Pierce thought cleaned toilets for a living. This was the person my family thought needed their concern and occasional financial help. This was the person who had spent 5 years taking family.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Calls between board meetings. Pretending to be too busy with maintenance emergencies to attend weddings and graduations and holiday dinners, all because I thought I was being humble, being kind, being the daughter and sister who didn't make anyone else feel small. But humility without boundaries isn't humility at all. It's self-erasure, and self-erasure doesn't protect anyone. It just creates space for people to fill in whatever story makes them most comfortable, even if that story diminishes you in ways you never consented to. I pulled up David Kellerman's original invitation email, sent 3 weeks ago through Wellington's managing partner, Amanda Foster. Apex Industries was looking for someone with my specific expertise in corporate transformation to join their board as they prepared for a major expansion into sustainable technology. The compensation alone was more than my family's hardware store grossed in a year, but more than that, it was recognition from one of the most respected CEOs in the Pacific Northwest that my work had value, that my insights mattered, that I belonged in rooms where decisions affecting thousands of people were made. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Vanessa Pierce was treating attendance at the Riverside Chamber of Commerce dinner like some sort of social achievement, I was being courted for a position that would put me in rooms with people who made decisions affecting entire industries. While my family worried about my simple little maintenance job, I was consulting on deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. While they saw someone who needed their gentle guidance and protection, the business world saw someone worth listening to. But the gap between those two perceptions wasn't their fault entirely. I had created it, maintained it, defended it for years because somewhere along the way, I'd confused being humble with being invisible. I'd confused protecting my family's feelings with lying about my life, and now, watching my phone light up with text messages from my mother asking if I was okay, from Marcus wondering why I'd left so abruptly, from Dad suggesting maybe I was being too sensitive about Vanessa's comment, I realized that my years of careful deception had created exactly the dynamic that allowed today's humiliation to happen. They didn't defend me because they thought there was nothing to defend. In their minds, Vanessa was right. I was the sister who cleaned buildings for a living, who drove an older car, who lived modestly and spoke quietly and never made waves. Of course someone like her would look down on someone like me. Of course she would feel comfortable making that comment in public. Of course they would all just stand there and let it happen. I had trained them to see me as someone who didn't require protection, who didn't deserve respect, who could absorb that kind of treatment because what else would someone in my position expect? The realization hit me like cold water. I hadn't been protecting them from my success. I'd been protecting myself from their potential resentment of it. I'd been so afraid that my achievements would make them uncomfortable, would change how they treated me, would create distance between us, that I'd chosen to maintain closeness through deception instead of risking honesty. But deception, no matter how well-intentioned, always comes due. And today, watching my brother's girlfriend use me as a social stepping stone, while my family watched in silence, I'd finally hit the bill. Monday morning came faster than usual. Tyler had already made the call to David Kellerman's office by the time I arrived at Wellington, and the response was immediate and enthusiastic. The Apex board appointment would be announced in 2 weeks, following standard vetting procedures and legal formalities. There would be a press conference, interviews with local business media, and a formal introduction at their quarterly shareholders meeting. My face would be on the cover of Portland Business Journal. My name would appear in press releases sent to every major newspaper in Oregon. Amanda Foster knocked on my office door around 10, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression she reserved for conversations she considered significant. Tyler filled me in on the Apex decision, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. I have to ask, Jess, are you prepared for the family fallout? Because once this goes public, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. Amanda knew about my double life, had even helped maintain it by allowing Tyler to field my family calls, and by agreeing to keep my consulting work out of any public recognition Wellington might receive. She understood why I'd made those choices, but she'd also watched me turn down opportunities and decline speaking engagements because they would have made my real career too visible. She'd seen me struggle with the cognitive dissonance of being one person at work and another person at home, and she'd wondered aloud more than once whether the cost was worth the supposed benefit. I think I told her, accepting the coffee, I'm about to find out what my family is really made of. And honestly, after yesterday, I'm not sure I care what the answer is. She studied my face carefully. Amanda Foster hadn't built Wellington Consulting by being sentimental about family dynamics, but she'd also seen enough brilliant people sabotage themselves over relationships that couldn't handle their success to recognize the warning signs. What happened yesterday? She asked simply. I told her about the barbecue, about Vanessa's comment, about the silence that followed, about the text messages I'd been ignoring since Sunday night asking why I was being so dramatic, and whether I was really going to let one offhand comment ruin Marcus's engagement celebration. I told her about years of careful lies and deliberate invisibility, about birthday presents I'd pretended I couldn't afford to buy, and Christmas dinners where I'd let my parents slip me grocery money while I had more in my checking account than they had in their retirement fund. Jesus, Jess, Amanda said when I finished, you've been living like a witness protection program victim. What were you so afraid of? That was the question, wasn't it? What had I been afraid of? That they'd resent my success, that they'd feel inadequate, that they'd treat me differently, expect things from me, see me as the successful one instead of just their Jess, that they'd love me less if I stopped being the person who needed their concern and started being the person who had her life completely figured out. Or maybe, if I was being completely honest, I'd been afraid they'd expect me to share my success in ways I wasn't ready for. That Dad would want help with the hardware store's mounting debts, that Mom would hint about early retirement, that Marcus would assume I could solve his financial problems. Maybe I'd been afraid that my money would become our money, that my achievements would become family resources, that my careful independence would dissolve into the kind of obligatory generosity that kills relationships slowly. But sitting in Amanda's office, watching Portland's Monday morning bustle through floor-to-ceiling windows, I realized that my fears had created exactly the situation I'd been trying to avoid. By hiding my success, I'd made it impossible for my family to love and respect the person I actually was. Instead, they'd fallen in love with a fiction, a careful construction of humility and struggle that bore no resemblance to my real life. And when someone like Vanessa Pierce attacked that fiction, they had no reason to defend it because they believed it was true. I think I told Amanda, I was afraid they'd want me to be responsible for fixing their problems instead of just loving them. But by pretending I didn't have the ability to help, I also eliminated any reason for them to respect me. And respect, it turns out, is non-negotiable. Amanda smiled, the kind of smile she gave clients when they finally understood what needed to be done. So what's the plan? The plan was simple, terrifying, and long overdue. I was going to stop being afraid of my own success. I was going to accept the Apex board position, do the interviews, appear in the business journals, and let my family discover who I really was the same way everyone else would, by reading about it in the newspaper. I wasn't going to call them, wasn't going to explain or apologize, or ease them into it gently. I was going to let the truth speak for itself, and see what happened next, because the truth was this: I was Jessica Mitchell, and I was successful beyond their wildest imagination. I was the person companies called when they needed someone smart enough to save them, and brave enough to tell them hard truths. I was the person David Kellerman wanted advising him on decisions that would affect thousands of employees and millions in revenue. I was someone worth defending, worth respecting, worth including in conversations about the future. And if my family couldn't handle that truth, if they'd rather maintain relationships with a fiction than adapt to reality, then maybe it was time to find out what losing them actually cost, versus what keeping them had already taken from me. The decision felt clean in a way that surprised me. For 5 years I'd been carrying the weight of maintaining two completely different lives, spending emotional energy on elaborate deceptions, turning down opportunities because they might expose the truth. Now, finally, I was ready to see what happened when I stopped managing everyone else's comfort and started living as myself. 2 weeks later, everything changed. The Portland Business Journal hit newsstands on a Tuesday morning in late July, and my face was on the cover above the headline "Local Consultant Joins Apex Industries Board." The photo they'd chosen was from the previous month's Wellington Consulting annual report. Me in a charcoal suit standing in front of the Portland skyline, looking every inch the successful executive I'd hidden from my family for half a decade. The article inside was 3 pages long, complete with quotes from David Kellerman about my exceptional strategic insight, and a sidebar detailing my educational background and professional achievements. My phone started ringing at 6:30 that morning. Tyler had warned me this would happen, had even suggested I take a few days off, and let him field the initial wave of family reactions. But I was done hiding, done managing other people's emotions about my life, done pretending that their comfort was more important than my truth. So I sat in my kitchen, watching the sunrise paint the river gold, and let every call go to voicemail. The first was from Mom, her voice tight with confusion and something that might have been hurt. "Jessica, honey, there's a picture of you in the business section, and I think there's been some kind of mistake. Can you call me when you get this? Dad and I are very confused." The second was Marcus, sounding genuinely bewildered. "Jess, what the hell is going on? Vanessa's friend called her about some article, and we don't understand what's happening. Are you in some kind of trouble?"
Oh,
By noon I had 17 voicemails and 43 text messages. The progression was fascinating to watch, like studying the stages of grief in real time. Confusion gave way to disbelief, disbelief to anger, anger to something that looked like panic. Dad's voice grew increasingly agitated with each message. "Jessica Marie Mitchell, you call me back right now. We need to talk about this newspaper business immediately." Marcus's texts evolved from bewildered questions, to demands for explanations, to accusations that I'd somehow betrayed the family by lying to them. But it was Vanessa's reaction that told me everything I needed to know about the dynamic I'd been protecting all these years. She'd left 3 voicemails, each one more shrill than the last. In the final one, her voice cracked with genuine distress as she said, "I don't understand why you didn't tell us who you really were. I feel like such an idiot now, and Marcus is furious with me. You should have said something at the barbecue instead of letting me make a fool of myself." There it was, the heart of it. Not an apology for her cruelty, not remorse for the humiliation she'd inflicted, but anger that I'd allowed her to reveal her true character instead of protecting her from the consequences of her own choices. She was upset that I'd let her show everyone exactly who she was when she thought she was safe to do so. The woman who'd felt comfortable mocking what she believed was my humble station in life, was now terrified that her cruelty had been witnessed by someone who actually mattered. I spent that Tuesday in meetings, letting Tyler manage the flood of interview requests and media inquiries that followed the Business Journal piece. Local television stations wanted comments, business magazines requested profiles, and the Portland Chamber of Commerce asked if I'd consider speaking at their upcoming leadership summit. My real life, the one I'd kept hidden for years, was suddenly very public and very much in demand. At Wellington, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Colleagues who'd respected my work but never fully understood my insistence on maintaining such a low profile, now saw the board appointment as validation of what they'd always known about my capabilities. Amanda Foster was practically glowing as she forwarded congratulatory emails from clients and competitors alike. "I have to admit," she told me over lunch, "watching you step into the light like this is incredibly satisfying. You should have done this years ago." But the family situation was deteriorating rapidly. By Wednesday evening, when I finally decided to check my messages, the tone had shifted from confusion to ultimatum. Dad's voice was cold with the kind of anger he reserved for situations he couldn't control. "Jessica, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you owe us an explanation. We raised you better than this, and I expect you to act like the daughter we taught you to be. Call me back tonight, or I'm driving to Portland myself." Marcus had moved past bewilderment into something approaching fury. His text messages read like accusations in a court filing. How could you lie to us for years? Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? Vanessa's friends are asking her questions she can't answer. Dad's customers are congratulating him on his successful daughter, and he has no idea what to say. You've made our entire family look like idiots. The thing that struck me most about their reactions wasn't the anger or the confusion. It was the complete absence of pride, of congratulations, of any acknowledgement that I'd achieved something remarkable. Not one message expressed happiness for my success or curiosity about my journey. Every single communication was focused on how my truth had inconvenienced them, how my achievements had somehow wronged them, how my decision to stop lying had created problems they now expected me to solve. Thursday morning brought a knock on my door at 7:15. Through the peephole, I could see Dad standing in the hallway outside my apartment, still wearing the Mitchell's Hardware polo shirt he'd probably slept in. His face set in the grim expression he used to wear when Marcus and I had broken something expensive. I considered not answering, but 5 years of careful conflict avoidance had gotten me into this situation. Maybe it was time to try radical honesty instead. "Dad," I said, opening the door but not inviting him in. "You drove down early." "Jessica Marie," he said, using my full name like a weapon. "We need to talk." I stepped aside and let him into my apartment, watching his face as he took in the space I'd carefully hidden from him for years. The exposed brick walls, the custom kitchen island, the original hardwood floors that I'd had professionally refinished. The view of the river that had cost me an extra $800 a month in rent. The life that looked nothing like the modest existence they'd imagined for their daughter who supposedly cleaned buildings for a living. He walked to the windows, stared out at the Portland skyline, then turned back to me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not quite anger, not quite hurt, something closer to betrayal mixed with genuine bewilderment. "I don't understand any of this, Jess. I don't understand why you would lie to us for years. I don't understand why you would let us worry about you when you were apparently doing just fine. And I really don't understand why you would humiliate us like this instead of just telling us the truth." "Humiliate you." The words came out sharper than I'd intended. "Dad, how exactly have I humiliated you?" "By making us look like fools, Jessica. By letting the whole town think we don't know our own daughter. By having strangers congratulate me on your success when I had no idea what they were talking about. By letting Vanessa say what she said at the barbecue when you could have just told her who you really were." There it was again, the same logic Vanessa had used in her voicemails. The idea that I should have protected them from the consequences of their own assumptions, their own judgments, their own willingness to stand by while someone they claimed to love was publicly diminished. The idea that my honesty was somehow an attack on them rather than a gift I'd finally decided to give myself. "Dad," I said, settling onto the couch and gesturing for him to sit down. "What did you think when Vanessa said what she said at the barbecue?" He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "I thought she was being unkind, but I also thought maybe you were being too sensitive about it. People say things sometimes, Jess. You can't take everything so personally. And you thought it was okay for her to talk about your daughter that way in front of the entire family. I thought," he said slowly, "that you could handle it. You've always been tough and independent. I didn't think you needed us to fight your battles for you. But you also didn't think I deserved basic respect and courtesy from someone who was about to become part of our family." Dad sat down heavily in the chair across from me, suddenly looking older than his 62 years. "That's not fair, Jessica. We've always respected you. We've always been proud of you for working hard and supporting yourself. We never thought there was anything wrong with honest work." "There isn't anything wrong with honest work, Dad. There's something wrong with assuming that honest work means someone deserves to be mocked for it. There's something wrong with thinking that cleaning toilets would make me less worthy of basic human dignity. And there's something really wrong with standing by while someone treats your child that way regardless of what you think they do for a living." He was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd said. Then he looked around my apartment again, taking in details he'd missed the first time. The expensive sound system, the artwork on the walls, the kitchen appliances that probably cost more than he made in a month. "So this is your real life," he said finally. "This apartment, this job, this board position thing. This is who you actually are. This is who I've been for years, Dad. This is who I was when you gave me $20 for gas money last Christmas. This is who I was when you suggested I apply for the assistant manager position at Murphy's grocery store because it would be more stable than maintenance work. This is who I was when you told me not to worry about contributing to Emma's birthday present because you knew money was tight for me." The color drained from his face as the implications sank in. Every conversation we'd had about my finances, every gentle suggestion about my career, every moment when they'd treated me like someone who needed their guidance and support, all of it based on lies I'd told to protect feelings that had never actually been in danger. "Why?" he asked, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he sounded more hurt than angry. "Why would you let us think you were struggling when you weren't? Why would you let us worry about you for no reason?" I'd been preparing for this question for weeks, ever since I'd made the decision to stop hiding. But sitting there looking at my father's face as he tried to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the woman sitting in front of him, I realized the answer was more complicated than I'd wanted to admit, because I was afraid. I said finally, "I was afraid that if you knew how successful I was, you'd expect things from me that I wasn't ready to give. I was afraid you'd want me to save the hardware store, or help with retirement, or become the family ATM. I was afraid that my money would become everyone's money, and my success would stop being mine." Dad nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "So you thought we'd use you? I thought you might ask me for help, and I wasn't sure I'd be able to say no, and I was afraid that would change everything between us. I wanted you to love me for who I was, not what I could do for you, but instead you made it so we didn't know who you were at all." The simple truth of that statement hit harder than any anger or accusation could have. I'd been so focused on protecting myself from their potential expectations that I'd made it impossible for them to love the real me. I'd chosen the safety of fictional relationships over the risk of authentic ones, and in doing so I'd cheated all of us out of years of genuine connection. "Yeah," I said quietly, "I did." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the weight of what had been revealed. Finally, Dad stood up and walked back to the windows, staring out at the city I'd made my home while telling them I couldn't afford to visit more often. "The hardware store is failing, Jess," he said without turning around. "Has been for 3 years now. Between the big box stores and online shopping, we can't compete anymore. Mom and I have been talking about closing it down, maybe selling the building and retiring early. We didn't want to worry you because we thought you had your own problems to deal with." I felt something twist in my chest, a combination of guilt and vindication that was almost physical in its intensity. They'd been protecting me from their struggles, while I'd been protecting myself from their potential expectations, and in the process, we'd all been carrying burdens that didn't need to be carried alone. "How long before you have to make a decision?" I asked. "End of the year probably, maybe sooner. If the Christmas season is as bad as last year." I thought about the hardware store, about the countless hours I'd spent there as a child, learning inventory and watching Dad help customers solve problems with patience and expertise that no big box store could match. I thought about the community it served, the relationships it had fostered, the way it had been the heart of Riverside's small business district for 30 years. And I thought about the woman I'd become, the consultant who specialized in business transformation, who'd helped dozens of companies navigate exactly this kind of challenge. The irony was almost painful. While I'd been hiding my ability to help, they'd been struggling with exactly the kind of problem I solved for a living. "Dad," I said, "what if there was a way to save it?" He turned around, hope and skepticism warring in his expression. "Jess, honey, we've looked at every option. We've talked to the bank, worked with consultants, tried everything we can think of. Sometimes businesses just run their course. But have you talked to the right consultant? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with 5 years of missed opportunities and careful deceptions. Dad looked at me with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time not his little girl who needed protection, but a woman who might actually have something valuable to offer. Would you be willing to take a look at our books? He asked quietly. Not as my daughter, who I'm asking for help, but as a professional who might have ideas we haven't considered. It was the first time in years that he'd asked me for something based on my capabilities rather than my willingness to be generous. The first time he'd approached me as an equal rather than someone who needed his guidance. The first time our relationship had felt like it might be built on mutual respect rather than careful management of each other's feelings. I'd be honored to, I said, not as your daughter, but as someone who believes that businesses like yours matter, and someone who's gotten pretty good at finding solutions that aren't immediately obvious. Dad smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since he'd arrived. I think I'd like to meet this daughter of mine, the one I apparently never knew, the one who's successful enough to afford a place like this and important enough to serve on corporate boards. I think I might be pretty proud of her, once I get used to the idea that she exists. She's been here the whole time, Dad. She just got tired of hiding. We spent the next 2 hours talking in a way we hadn't since I was a teenager, before I'd learned to edit myself for his comfort. I told him about Stanford, about the early years at Wellington when I'd worked 18-hour days to prove myself, about the clients I'd helped save and the strategies I'd developed. He told me about the struggles with the store, about watching Riverside change around them, about the guilt he felt over potentially letting down employees who'd worked for him for decades. For the first time in years, we talked like two adults who respected each other's intelligence and experience. Not parent and child, not protector and protected, but two people who happened to share blood and love and a mutual investment in each other's well-being. When he finally got ready to leave, Dad paused at the door and looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Jess, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me, okay? When Vanessa said what she said at the barbecue, and we didn't defend you, how much did that hurt? I considered lying, softening it, protecting him from the full weight of how that moment had felt. Then I remembered where protecting feelings had gotten us, and decided to try radical honesty instead. It broke something in me, Dad, not because she said it, but because all of you let her say it. Because you all stood there and let someone who barely knows me treat me like I was worth less than basic respect. Because even if I really had been a janitor, even if I really had cleaned toilets for a living, I still would have deserved better than that. And the fact that none of you seemed to think so made me realize that maybe I'd been hiding from you for good reason. Dad's face crumpled slightly, and for a moment I thought he might cry. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm sorrier than I know how to express. You deserved better from us, and especially from me. I should have spoken up, regardless of what any of us thought about your job or your life. That was wrong, and I was wrong, and I hope you'll give me a chance to do better. That's all I've ever wanted, Dad, just a chance for us to do better. After he left, I sat in my apartment as the sun set over Portland, thinking about the conversation we'd just had, and the ones that were still to come. Marcus would be harder to reach, I suspected. His pride was more fragile than Dad's, and Vanessa's influence would complicate things in ways I couldn't predict. Mom would need time to process the idea that her daughter hadn't needed her worry or her grocery money for years. But for the first time since this whole revelation had begun, I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope. Not hope that we could go back to the way things were, because the way things were had been built on deception and careful management of uncomfortable truths. Hope that we might be able to build something better, something based on who we actually were, rather than who we thought we were supposed to be. The phone rang as I was making dinner, Tyler's name appearing on the screen. How'd it go with your dad? He asked, without preamble. Better than I expected. Actually, he wants me to look at their business books, see if there's a way to save the hardware store, and you're going to do it. I thought about the question, about the implications of getting involved in my family's business after years of careful separation, About the risk of mixing professional responsibilities with personal relationships, about the possibility that helping them might complicate the boundaries I was trying to establish. Yeah, I said finally, I think I am, but this time, I'm going in as myself. No more pretending to be someone I'm not to make other people comfortable. Good, Tyler said. It's about time they met the real Jessica Mitchell. I think they're going to be impressed. As I hung up the phone, I realized he was right. After 5 years of hiding my capabilities to protect other people's feelings, I was finally ready to find out what kind of relationships were possible when everyone involved knew exactly who they were dealing with. It was terrifying and liberating and long overdue. The real Jessica Mitchell was about to meet her family for the first time, and whatever happened next, at least it would be honest. The following Monday morning arrived with a phone call that changed everything once again. David Kellerman's voice was warm but professional as he explained that Apex Industries would be hosting a press conference to announce the new board appointments, and they'd like me to attend as one of the featured speakers. We're particularly excited to highlight your expertise in corporate transformation, he said. Given the current economic climate, having someone with your background join our leadership team sends a strong message to our stakeholders. The press conference was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at the Apex Industries headquarters downtown, a gleaming 30-story building that dominated Portland's business district. Local media would be present, along with business leaders from across the Pacific Northwest. It would be my first public appearance as a board member, and Tyler was already fielding interview requests from journalists who wanted to speak with me beforehand. This is exactly the kind of visibility you've been avoiding for years, Amanda Foster pointed out over coffee Tuesday morning. Are you sure you're ready for this level of public scrutiny? Once you're on camera talking about corporate strategy and market analysis, there's no pretending you're anything other than exactly who you are. I thought about her question as I walked back to my office, considering the implications of stepping fully into the spotlight after years of careful invisibility, but the truth was, I felt more ready than I'd ever been. The conversation with Dad had shown me something I hadn't expected, that honesty, even painful honesty, could create space for relationships I'd never imagined possible, and if that was true with my family, maybe it was true with the rest of the world as well. Wednesday evening brought another surprise. Marcus called, the first time we'd spoken directly since the Business Journal article had been published. His voice was tight with emotions I couldn't quite identify when he asked if we could meet for coffee before I left for the press conference. There are things I need to say to you, he said, things that can't wait any longer. We met at a small cafe near my apartment, one of those places with exposed brick walls and local artwork that had become synonymous with Portland's transformation from blue-collar port city to tech hub. Marcus arrived first, already seated at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee in front of him, looking more serious than I'd seen him since our grandfather's funeral 5 years earlier. I've been thinking about what happened at the barbecue, he said, without preamble as I sat down across from him, about what Vanessa said, about what we all did, about what we didn't do, and I've been thinking about the lies you told us, about the life you've been living that we knew nothing about. I waited, letting him find his words. Marcus had always been the more emotional of the two of us, quick to anger, but also quick to recognize when he'd been wrong. The struggle playing out across his face suggested he was working through something complicated. I'm angry, he said, finally. I'm angry that you lied to us for years, that you let us believe things about your life that weren't true, that you made decisions about our relationship without including us in those decisions. But I'm also angry at myself, because the more I think about it, the more I realize that maybe you had good reasons to hide from us. He paused, staring into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers he couldn't find elsewhere. Vanessa's been talking to her friends about you since the article came out, about how embarrassing it is that she said what she said to someone who apparently matters in the business world, about how you should have told her who you really were so she wouldn't have made that mistake. And listening to her, I realize something that makes me sick to my stomach. What's that? She's not sorry she was cruel to you. She's sorry she was cruel to someone important. And the fact that I didn't see that difference immediately tells me something about myself that I don't like very much. Marcus looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't expected: genuine remorse, mixed with a kind of self-awareness that was new for him. You want to know the truth about why none of us defended you at the barbecue? It's because we all believed, on some level, that what she said was acceptable. Not the cruelty of it, but the content of it. We all believed that someone who cleaned toilets for a living was somehow less deserving of respect than someone who didn't. And that's not your fault for lying to us. That's our fault for being the kind of people who would think that way in the first place. The admission hung between us, heavy with implications that went far beyond a single moment of family dysfunction. Marcus was acknowledging something I'd suspected, but hadn't wanted to face: that my family's willingness to let Vanessa humiliate me had revealed something fundamental about their values, something that my deception had perhaps enabled, but hadn't created. I've been engaged to Vanessa for 3 weeks, Marcus continued, and in that time, I've watched her treat 3 different service workers like they were invisible. The woman who cleaned our hotel room in Seattle, the kid who bagged our groceries at Safeway, the server at that restaurant we went to with her parents. I told myself she was just having bad days, or that she was nervous about meeting my family, or that I was being too sensitive. But watching her panic about what she said to you, watching her worry about how it makes her look rather than how it made you feel, I'm starting to understand that this is who she is when she thinks no one important is watching. I felt something shift inside me, a loosening of tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Marcus wasn't just apologizing for his failure to defend me, he was recognizing the pattern of behavior that had made that failure possible. He was seeing Vanessa clearly for perhaps the first time, and he was seeing himself clearly too. What are you going to do about it? I asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the table. I think I'm going to call off the engagement, he said finally. Not because of what she said to you, although that's part of it, but because I'm realizing that I don't want to spend my life with someone who thinks other people's worth is determined by their job title or their bank account. And I don't want to become the kind of person who stands by and watches while someone I claim to love gets treated like garbage. The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming, not because I'd wanted their relationship to fail, but because Marcus's recognition of the problem meant that maybe, just maybe, we could build something better from here. Maybe the revelation of my true circumstances could serve as a catalyst for all of us to examine the assumptions and prejudices we'd been carrying without questioning them. That's not going to be easy, I said. She's not going to take it well, and her family has connections in Riverside that could make things complicated for Mom and Dad. I know, but you know what Dad told me yesterday? He said that watching you walk away from us at the barbecue, watching you choose dignity over family approval, was the first time in years he'd been genuinely proud of one of his children. He said it made him realize that maybe we'd all gotten a little too comfortable with compromise, a little too willing to overlook cruelty if it made our lives easier. I stared at Marcus, processing what he'd just revealed. Dad had been proud of me for leaving the barbecue, for refusing to accept Vanessa's treatment. The man who'd spent years teaching us that family loyalty trumped everything else had apparently recognized that there were limits to what family members should be expected to tolerate from each other. He really said that. He did. And he also said something else that I think you should know. He said that the reason you probably felt safe lying to us about your success was because we'd spent years making it clear that we were more comfortable with you as someone who needed our help than someone who might have something to offer us. He said we'd trained you to believe that our love was conditional on your need for it. The insight was so accurate, it took my breath away. That was exactly what I'd been afraid of, exactly why I'd hidden my achievements and downplayed my capabilities. I'd believed, perhaps correctly, that my family's affection was tied to their ability to feel useful to me, to feel like the successful ones, the ones with wisdom to offer and resources to share. I'd been afraid that my success would eliminate their sense of purpose in my life, and that without that purpose, their love might evaporate. So what happens now? I asked. Marcus leaned back in his chair, looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. Now we all learn how to love each other without anyone having to pretend to be smaller than they are. You stop hiding your success, I stop overlooking cruelty, and hopefully, we all get better at recognizing each other's actual worth, instead of the stories we tell ourselves about each other's worth. We talked for another hour, working through years of misunderstandings and missed opportunities. Marcus told me about his own struggles with the hardware store, how he'd been feeling pressured to take over the business, despite having no passion for retail, and no aptitude for the kind of customer service that made Dad successful. I told him about the consulting work I'd been doing in secret, about the companies I'd helped save, and the strategies I'd developed for exactly the kind of challenges the hardware store was facing. Would you be willing to look at our situation? He asked. Not as my sister who I'm guilting into helping, but as a professional consultant, who might have ideas we haven't considered. It was almost exactly the same question Dad had asked, but coming from Marcus it felt different. Dad had approached me with the careful humility of someone who'd realized he'd misjudged a situation. Marcus was approaching me with the straightforward respect of someone who'd recognized my professional capabilities and wanted to benefit from them. I'd be happy to, I said, but I want to be clear about something. If I take on your situation as a consulting project, I'll approach it the same way I approach all my consulting projects. That means honest assessments, difficult recommendations, and no sugarcoating to protect feelings. If the best solution for the hardware store is to close it down and liquidate the assets, that's what I'll recommend. If the best solution requires changes that you or Dad aren't willing to make, I'll tell you that too. I won't compromise my professional judgment to maintain family harmony. Marcus nodded slowly. That's exactly what we need. We've been too close to the problem for too long, too invested in preserving things the way they've always been to see clearly what needs to change. Maybe having someone who loves us, but isn't emotionally attached to the business itself, is exactly what this situation requires. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Pacific Northwest weather that somehow felt appropriate for the day I would officially step into my new public role. Tyler had arranged for a car to pick me up at 10:30, giving me plenty of time to review my notes and prepare for the questions I was likely to face from the media. The Apex Industries headquarters was even more impressive up close than it had looked from my apartment windows. The lobby was all marble and glass, with water features and contemporary art that spoke to both success and environmental consciousness. David Kellerman met me at the reception desk, accompanied by Charles Whitman, the board chairman, and two other executives whose names I recognized from business publications. Jessica, David said, extending his hand with a warm smile, I'm so glad you could join us today. We're genuinely excited to have you on the board, and we think your background in corporate transformation is going to be invaluable as we navigate some significant changes in our industry. The press conference was held in a conference room on the 20th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Portland and the Cascade Mountains beyond. About 30 people were present, a mix of journalists, industry analysts, and Apex employees. Camera crews from 3 local television stations had set up equipment, and I could see photographers positioning themselves for the best angles. David introduced the new board members one by one, spending several minutes on my background and qualifications. As he spoke about my work in corporate restructuring and my success in helping companies navigate complex market transitions, I found myself thinking about my family watching this coverage, seeing me described as an expert in exactly the kinds of challenges they were facing with their own business. When it came time for me to speak, I felt a calm confidence I hadn't expected. This was my world, the professional arena, where I'd spent years building expertise and reputation. After so many years of hiding these capabilities, stepping into the spotlight felt less like exposure and more like homecoming. Thank you, David, I said, approaching the podium. I'm honored to join the Apex Industries board at such an exciting time in the company's evolution. Corporate transformation isn't just about numbers and strategies, it's about understanding that businesses are ultimately about people and communities. The most successful transformations are the ones that honor the past, while building toward a future that serves everyone involved. The questions that followed were thoughtful and challenging, covering everything from market trends to environmental sustainability to the role of technology in manufacturing. I found myself drawing on years of experience consulting with companies across multiple industries, synthesizing complex information into accessible insights that could serve both technical and general audiences. One journalist asked about my background, noting that my appointment represented a significant addition to Portland's business leadership landscape. "You've maintained a relatively low public profile despite your professional achievements," she said. "What made you decide to step into this more visible role?" The question offered me an opportunity to address the broader themes of authenticity and professional courage that had brought me to this moment. "I think there's value in allowing your work to speak for itself," I said. "But there's also value in stepping forward when you have something meaningful to contribute to important conversations." Apex Industries is making decisions that will affect thousands of employees and communities across the region. Being part of that leadership team means accepting responsibility for outcomes that extend far beyond any individual company or career. After the press conference, David invited me to join the other board members for lunch in the executive dining room. The conversation was substantive and wide-ranging, covering industry trends, regulatory challenges, and strategic opportunities. For the first time in years, I was able to participate fully in professional discussions without worrying about hiding my knowledge or downplaying my expertise. Charles Whitman, the board chairman, pulled me aside as we were leaving. "I've been watching your career for several years," he said. "Amanda Foster at Wellington has mentioned your work in contexts that made it clear you were someone worth knowing. I'm curious why you've kept such a low profile when your achievements suggest you could have been much more visible in the business community." I considered how to answer his question, recognizing that my response would likely influence how he and other board members understood my approach to leadership and public engagement. "I think visibility should serve a purpose beyond personal advancement," I said finally. "I focused on doing work that matters, with clients who needed the kind of help I could provide. Now I'm in a position where increased visibility can serve broader goals, can contribute to conversations that affect more than just individual companies or consulting relationships." Charles nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of perspective we need on this board. Too many leaders today are focused on building personal brands, rather than building sustainable value. Your approach suggests you understand the difference." As I rode back to my apartment that afternoon, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just 2 weeks. The woman who had sat silently while someone mocked her supposed job cleaning toilets was now a public figure whose insights on corporate strategy would be quoted in tomorrow's business section. The daughter who had hidden her success to protect her family's feelings was now positioned to potentially save her family's business using expertise they hadn't known she possessed. But the most significant change wasn't in my public profile or professional opportunities. It was in my relationship with myself, in my willingness to be fully present in my own life instead of constantly editing myself for other people's comfort. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living as one integrated person, rather than maintaining separate versions of myself for different audiences. My phone buzzed with a text message from Tyler as I walked into my building. "Watched the press conference online. You were brilliant. Also, your mother called the office 3 times, asking for the number to reach David Kellerman directly. I told her I'd pass along her message that she's very proud of her daughter, but I thought you should know she's apparently planning to call Apex Industries to congratulate them on their good judgment." I laughed out loud in the elevator, imagining Mom calling one of the largest corporations in the Pacific Northwest to share her maternal pride with David Kellerman personally. It was exactly the kind of thing she would do, the kind of enthusiastic support that had always embarrassed me slightly, but that I was beginning to appreciate as evidence of genuine love, rather than social awkwardness. That evening, I opened my laptop and began drafting the preliminary analysis I'd promised to prepare for Mitchell's Hardware and Garden Center. It felt strange to apply my professional methodology to my family's business, to analyze their financial statements and market position with the same objectivity I brought to paying clients. But it also felt like the most honest way I could contribute to their situation, offering my expertise without compromise while maintaining the boundaries that would allow me to be helpful rather than enabling. The numbers told a story I'd expected but hadn't wanted to face. The hardware store was indeed failing not because of poor management or lack of effort, but because the fundamental economics of small-town retail had shifted in ways that made their traditional business model unsustainable. Without significant changes in approach, inventory management, and customer engagement, they would be forced to close within 6 months. But the analysis also revealed opportunities that hadn't been obvious to them, ways to leverage their existing relationships and local knowledge to create new revenue streams that could complement rather than compete with the big box stores. The key would be transforming from a traditional hardware retailer into a community resource center that provided services and expertise rather than just products. As I worked through the financial projections and strategic recommendations, I realized that this project represented more than just family assistance. It was an opportunity to apply everything I'd learned about corporate transformation to a business I cared about personally, to test whether the strategies that worked for large corporations could be adapted to serve small family businesses facing existential challenges. It was also an opportunity to build a new kind of relationship with my family, one based on mutual respect and honest contribution rather than careful deception and managed expectations. For the first time in years, I was approaching them as myself, offering my actual capabilities rather than a fictional version designed to make everyone comfortable. The analysis was complex and would require several more days to complete properly, but as I saved my initial notes and closed my laptop, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete integration between my professional skills and my personal relationships. No more compartmentalization, no more careful editing, no more pretending to be smaller than I was to protect other people's feelings. Tomorrow I would call Dad and Marcus to schedule a meeting where I could present my findings and recommendations. It would be the first time I'd ever approached my family as a consultant rather than a daughter, the first time I'd offered professional expertise rather than emotional support. It was terrifying and exhilarating and long overdue. Outside my windows, Portland stretched toward the mountains, lights beginning to twinkle as the city settled into evening. Somewhere out there, my family was adjusting to the reality of who I actually was, processing the implications of 5 years of careful deception, and hopefully beginning to understand that love doesn't require anyone to make themselves smaller than they are. The real Jessica Mitchell was finally home. 6 months later, I stood in the transformed Mitchell's Hardware and Garden Center, watching Dad explain a complex irrigation system to a customer while Marcus handled the new small business consulting services we'd launched from the back office. The store looked nothing like it had during my childhood visits, but it felt exactly the same: a place where people came for solutions, expertise, and the kind of personal attention that no algorithm could replicate. The transformation had been more dramatic than anyone had expected, including me. After presenting my analysis to Dad and Marcus in a conference room at Wellington Consulting, we'd spent 3 weeks developing a comprehensive restructuring plan that went far beyond simple cost-cutting or inventory adjustments. The new Mitchell's was part traditional hardware store, part community workshop space, part small business incubator, and part educational center for sustainable living practices. The financial turnaround had been swift once we implemented the new revenue streams: corporate consulting for other family businesses facing similar challenges, weekend workshops on everything from basic home repair to organic gardening, and a partnership with the local community college for vocational training programs had transformed the store from a dying retail operation into a thriving community resource that generated income from multiple sources. But the most significant transformation hadn't been financial, it had been relational. Working together on the business restructuring had created a new dynamic between me and my family, one based on mutual respect and honest collaboration, rather than careful management of each other's feelings. For the first time in years, I felt like we were actually seeing each other clearly. Emma, now 9 years old, had become my unofficial assistant during weekend workshops, helping distribute materials and answer questions with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd inherited the family talent for making customers feel heard and valued. Watching her interact with adults who treated her insights seriously reminded me of my own childhood in the store before I'd learned to edit myself for other people's comfort. "Aunt Jess," she said, as we were closing up on a Saturday evening in February, "why did you pretend to have a different job for so long?" The question was delivered with the directness that only children possess, cutting through years of adult complexity to the essential issue. I considered how to answer in a way that honored both her intelligence and her age. "Because I was scared," I said finally. "I was scared that if people knew how successful I was, they might want things from me that I wasn't ready to give. And I was scared that they might love me differently, or expect me to be someone I wasn't ready to be." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "But they loved you wrong when you pretended, didn't they? They loved the pretend you instead of the real you." The insight was so accurate it took my breath away. "Yes," I said, "they did. And that wasn't fair to any of us." "I'm glad you stopped pretending," she said. "The real you is much more interesting." Later that evening, as I drove back to Portland, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that 4th of July barbecue 8 months earlier. The woman who had sat silently while Vanessa Pierce mocked her supposed profession was now splitting her time between serving on a Fortune 500 board and helping small family businesses navigate existential challenges. The daughter who had hidden her success to protect her family's feelings was now working openly with them to build something sustainable and meaningful. But perhaps most importantly, I was no longer afraid of my own capabilities. The years of hiding had taught me that invisibility isn't protection, it's self-erasure, and self-erasure doesn't preserve relationships, it prevents them from becoming real. Marcus had ended his engagement to Vanessa 3 weeks after our coffee shop conversation, a decision that had sent shockwaves through Riverside social circles, but had ultimately been met with more support than criticism. Apparently, others had noticed her tendency to treat service workers poorly, and Marcus's willingness to prioritize character over social convenience had earned him respect from quarters he hadn't expected. He was now dating Sarah Chen, a teacher at the local elementary school who treated everyone from the janitor to the principal with the same warm respect she showed her students. The contrast with Vanessa was so stark that it made me wonder how Marcus had ever convinced himself that cruelty was acceptable as long as it wasn't directed at him personally. "I think I was attracted to Vanessa because she made me feel important," Marcus had admitted during one of our weekly strategy meetings for the hardware store. "She looked up to me, deferred to my opinions, made me feel like I was the successful one in the relationship. But watching her interact with other people, I realized that her respect for me was based on hierarchy, not genuine appreciation. And respect that depends on other people being diminished isn't actually respect at all." The insight had struck me as particularly relevant to my own situation. I'd spent years hiding my success partly because I'd been afraid that my achievements would diminish my family's sense of their own worth. But in trying to protect their egos, I'd prevented them from developing the kind of genuine respect that could only come from knowing and appreciating who I actually was. Mom had struggled the most with the revelations about my hidden life, not because she resented my success, but because she felt guilty about the years she'd spent worrying about my financial situation and offering help I hadn't needed. "I gave you grocery money when you were making more in a month than we made in a quarter," she'd said during a particularly emotional conversation. "I suggested you apply for jobs that would have been massive steps backward for you professionally. I treated you like someone who needed my guidance when you were obviously the one with wisdom to offer." It had taken months of patient conversation to help her understand that my deception hadn't been a judgment of her intelligence or capabilities, but a product of my own fears and insecurities. I'd hidden my success not because I thought she couldn't handle it, but because I'd been afraid of how it might change our relationship. "I wanted you to love me for who I was, not what I could do for you," I'd explained. "But in trying to preserve that, I made it impossible for you to love the real me at all." The process of rebuilding trust had been complicated and sometimes painful, but it had also created space for relationships that were deeper and more authentic than anything we'd had before. Mom now called me for advice on everything from retirement planning to small business marketing, approaching me as a professional whose expertise she valued rather than a daughter whose feelings she needed to protect. Dad had embraced the new dynamic with characteristic pragmatism, throwing himself into implementing the business transformation strategies with the same focused energy he'd once devoted to helping customers solve plumbing problems. "I don't pretend to understand half of what you're talking about when you get into the financial analysis," he'd told me. "But I understand results, and I understand that you've given us a way forward that we couldn't have found on our own." The store's success had attracted attention from other family businesses facing similar challenges, and we'd begun offering consulting services that drew on both my strategic expertise and Dad's decades of experience in customer service and community building. It was a partnership that honored both our skill sets while creating something neither of us could have achieved alone. The Apex Industries board position had evolved into something more significant than I'd initially expected. David Kellerman had asked me to chair a new committee focused on sustainable business practices and community engagement, a role that allowed me to apply lessons learned from the hardware store transformation to much larger corporate challenges. "What you've done with your family's business is exactly the kind of thinking we need to bring to our community partnerships," David had said during our most recent board meeting. "You've proven that small businesses can adapt and thrive when they focus on serving genuine community needs rather than competing on price and convenience alone." The visibility that came with the board position had opened doors I hadn't expected. Speaking engagements, consulting opportunities, and invitations to serve on other boards had transformed my professional profile from behind-the-scenes consultant to recognized thought leader in sustainable business transformation. But the most rewarding aspect of the increased visibility had been the opportunity to advocate for the kind of business practices that honored both profitability and community well-being. I'd spent years helping individual companies solve their problems. Now I was positioned to influence broader conversations about how businesses could serve stakeholders beyond just shareholders. 1 year after the barbecue incident that had changed everything, Riverside hosted its annual 4th of July celebration in the park behind the hardware store. The Mitchell family booth was one of the most popular stops, offering demonstrations of sustainable gardening techniques and free consultations for small business owners facing economic challenges. I watched from behind our information table as families enjoyed the festivities, thinking about how different this gathering felt from the previous year's barbecue. Then I'd been hiding my true self to protect other people's comfort. Now I was fully present in my own life, contributing my actual capabilities rather than a carefully edited version designed to make everyone else feel secure. Vanessa Pierce was notably absent from the celebration, having moved back to Seattle after her breakup with Marcus. Her departure had been met with a mixture of relief and awkward social shuffling among the families who'd welcomed her into their circles based more on her confidence than her character. "I heard she's engaged to some tech executive she met through her father's real estate connections," Mrs. Carter had mentioned to Mom while buying organic tomato plants from our booth. Apparently she told people that she broke up with Marcus because his family wasn't sophisticated enough for her lifestyle aspirations. The comment had stung initially, not because I valued Vanessa's opinion but because it suggested she'd learned nothing from the experience of discovering my true professional status. She'd apparently decided that the problem hadn't been her willingness to mock someone based on perceived social status, but her failure to gather better intelligence before revealing her character so clearly. But her inability to grow from the experience wasn't my responsibility. I'd spent enough years managing other people's comfort and protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. Vanessa Pierce's journey toward becoming a better person, if she ever chose to take it, would have to happen without my involvement or concern. Marcus had handled her departure with a maturity that impressed everyone who knew him. "I think she convinced herself that the problem was my family's lack of sophistication rather than her own lack of kindness," he'd said. "And honestly, I'm grateful for that. It makes it easier to move forward without feeling like I need to fix anything or prove anything to anyone." As the evening wound down and we began packing up our booth, Emma helped me fold the tablecloths while chattering about her plans to study business when she got older. "I want to help families like you helped us," she said, "but I also want to make sure I never pretend to be someone I'm not because that just makes everything complicated." The wisdom in her simple statement struck me once again. She'd watched our family navigate the challenges of hidden truths and careful deceptions, and she'd learned lessons that it had taken me decades to understand. The next generation might approach authenticity and relationships with a clarity that my generation had to fight for. "That sounds like an excellent plan," I told her. "The world needs people who are brave enough to be themselves, even when it's scary or uncomfortable." "Were you scared when you finally told the truth about your job?" she asked. "Terrified," I admitted. But it turned out that the truth was much less frightening than I'd imagined, and it opened up possibilities I'd never even considered. Driving back to Portland that night, I thought about the journey that had brought me from that humiliating moment at the barbecue to this place of integration and authenticity. The decision to stop hiding my success had been the beginning of a transformation that went far beyond career visibility or family dynamics. I'd learned that humility without boundaries isn't humility at all, it's self-diminishment. I'd discovered that protecting other people from uncomfortable truths doesn't preserve relationships, it prevents them from becoming real. And I'd finally understood that love based on false premises isn't actually love, it's a transaction that inevitably becomes unsustainable. The woman who sat silently while Vanessa Pierce mocked her supposed profession no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood that respect must be mutual to be meaningful, that authenticity requires courage, but creates possibilities that deception can never offer, and that the people who truly love you want to know who you actually are, not who you think they need you to be. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler as I pulled into my parking garage. "Board meeting prep materials are on your desk for Monday. Also, 3 more family businesses want to schedule consultations based on recommendations from Mitchell's Hardware. And David Kellerman's assistant called to ask if you'd be interested in speaking at the Pacific Northwest Business Leadership Summit in September." I smiled as I read the message, thinking about how dramatically my life had evolved from the days when Tyler spent his time helping me maintain elaborate deceptions about my professional activities. Now he was managing a calendar that reflected my actual capabilities and interests, coordinating opportunities that aligned with who I really was rather than who I'd been pretending to be. As I walked through my apartment that night, I paused at the vision board I'd created 6 months earlier. The photo of myself at the Apex Industries press conference was surrounded by images representing the goals I was working towards: sustainable business practices, community engagement, authentic relationships, and the integration of professional success with personal values. But the most meaningful addition to the board was a small card that Emma had made for me, decorated with her drawings of flowers and bearing a message in her careful 9-year-old handwriting to Aunt Jess, who taught me that being real is better than being perfect. That simple truth had become the foundation for everything I was building now. Not perfection, not careful management of other people's feelings, not the exhausting work of maintaining separate versions of myself for different audiences. Just the radical act of showing up as myself, with all my capabilities and contradictions, and trusting that the people who mattered would prefer the real thing to any fiction I might offer instead. The journey from hidden consultant to visible leader, from protected daughter to respected professional, from careful deception to radical authenticity, had been more challenging and rewarding than I'd ever imagined possible. But as I prepared for sleep in my Portland apartment, surrounded by the life I'd finally allowed myself to live openly, I knew that the most important transformation hadn't been professional or familial, it had been personal. I'd finally learned to love myself enough to let other people see who I actually was, and in doing so, I'd discovered that authenticity isn't just about telling the truth about your accomplishments or your income. It's about having the courage to be fully present in your own life, to offer your real gifts rather than edited versions, and to trust that the people who matter will rise to meet you where you actually are. The woman who cleaned toilets had never existed except in the stories I told to protect myself from imaginary dangers. The woman who served on corporate boards and saved family businesses and spoke at leadership summits had been there all along, waiting for permission to step into the light, permission I'd finally learned that only I could give myself. 2 years after that transformative 4th of July barbecue, I found myself standing in the ballroom of Portland's most prestigious hotel, accepting the Pacific Northwest Business Leader of the Year award from the Regional Chamber of Commerce. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman Vanessa Pierce had once dismissed as a toilet cleaner was now being recognized alongside CEOs of major corporations and tech innovators who had shaped the region's economic landscape. David Kellerman was presenting the award, his speech highlighting not just my work with Apex Industries but my contributions to sustainable business transformation and community development. "Jessica Mitchell represents the best of Pacific Northwest leadership," he said to the audience of nearly 500 business leaders, politicians, and community advocates. "She's proven that success isn't just about individual achievement but about lifting entire communities and creating opportunities that didn't exist before." As I approached the podium to accept the Crystal Award, I caught sight of my family in the audience. Dad, wearing his best suit and looking prouder than I'd ever seen him. Mom, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Marcus, with his new wife Sarah Chen, both of them beaming. And Emma, now 11 years old, taking notes in a small notebook because she'd decided she wanted to write about the event for her school newspaper. The journey to this moment had been anything but straightforward. After the initial success of the hardware store transformation, word had spread throughout Oregon's small business community about the consultant who had saved Mitchell's Hardware and Garden Center. Within 6 months, I was fielding requests from family businesses across the Pacific Northwest, all facing similar challenges of adapting to changing economic conditions while maintaining their community connections. What started as occasional consulting work had evolved into something much larger. With Amanda Foster's blessing, I'd launched Mitchell Consulting, a specialized practice focused exclusively on helping family businesses navigate transformation challenges. The approach we'd developed at Dad's hardware store became a template that could be adapted to everything from small-town restaurants to multi-generational manufacturing companies. The success stories had been remarkable. A third-generation bakery in Bend that was losing customers to chain grocery stores transformed into a specialty catering business and culinary school. A family-owned bookstore in Astoria that couldn't compete with online retailers became a community literary center, offering author readings, writing workshops, and co-working space for local freelancers. A struggling farm-to-table restaurant in Hood River pivoted to become a farm-to-school program that supplied healthy meals to 3 school districts while training young people in sustainable agriculture. Each transformation required the same fundamental approach: honest assessment of current realities, creative reimagining of core capabilities, and the courage to change deeply ingrained patterns that were no longer serving anyone. It was work that drew on everything I'd learned about corporate strategy while honoring the human relationships and community connections that made family businesses different from their corporate counterparts. The visibility that came with this work had attracted attention from business schools, policymakers, and economic development organizations across the region. I'd been invited to speak at conferences from Seattle to San Francisco, sharing insights about sustainable business transformation and the crucial role of family enterprises in maintaining economic diversity and community resilience. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. The Small Business Administration had asked me to chair a new task force on rural economic development, focusing specifically on helping family businesses adapt to technological and market changes without losing their essential character. It was work that would influence policy at the federal level, potentially affecting thousands of businesses and the communities they served. The award ceremony continued around me as I reflected on how dramatically my understanding of success had evolved. 2 years earlier, success had meant hiding my achievements to protect other people's comfort. Now it meant using my visibility and expertise to create opportunities for others, to advocate for business practices that served communities as well as shareholders, and to demonstrate that authentic leadership could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. After the formal presentation, the evening shifted to networking and celebration. I found myself surrounded by people I'd only read about in business publications, executives and entrepreneurs who wanted to discuss everything from market trends to succession planning strategies. It was gratifying to be recognized as a peer by leaders I'd long admired, but the conversations that mattered most were still to come. Emma cornered me during the cocktail hour, her notebook still in hand and her expression serious with the weight of important questions. "Aunt Jess, can I interview you for my article? I want to write about what it's like to go from pretending to be unsuccessful to winning awards for being successful." Her directness still amazed me, the way she could cut through adult complexity to identify the essential story. "Of course," I said. "What do you want to know?" "Well, first, I want to know if you're happier now that everyone knows who you really are. And second, I want to know what advice you'd give to other people who are hiding parts of themselves because they're scared." We found a quiet corner of the ballroom where she could take notes properly, and I found myself answering questions with a honesty that would have terrified me just a few years earlier. Yes, I was happier living authentically, even though it had required difficult conversations and uncomfortable adjustments. Yes, I thought other people should consider whether their reasons for hiding were really about protecting others or about protecting themselves from imagined consequences. But what if people don't like the real you as much as they like the fake you? Emma asked, her pencil poised over her notebook. It was perhaps the most sophisticated question anyone had asked me about the transformation, and it came from an 11-year-old who'd watched the entire process unfold from her unique perspective. "Then they weren't really loving you in the first place," I said. "They were loving an idea of you, a story they told themselves about who you were. And love based on stories isn't actually love at all." Emma nodded thoughtfully and wrote that down word for word. "I think that's going to be the headline of my article," she said. Later that evening, after the formal ceremony had ended and most of the crowd had dispersed, my family gathered in the hotel's private dining room for a celebratory dinner. It was a tradition we'd started after the hardware store's first profitable quarter following its transformation, marking significant moments with the kind of unhurried conversation that had become possible once we stopped managing each other's feelings and started sharing our actual thoughts. Dad raised his glass of wine and looked around the table with an expression I'd never seen before, something that combined pride, gratitude, and a kind of wonder at how life could change so dramatically when people finally started telling each other the truth. 2 years ago," he said, "our family was falling apart and our business was failing, and we thought both problems were just bad luck, or changing times, or things beyond our control. Tonight, Jessica is being recognized as one of the most successful business leaders in the Pacific Northwest. And our hardware store is thriving in ways we never imagined possible. And I want to say something that I should have said a long time ago." He paused, looking directly at me with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "Jess, I'm sorry it took me so long to see who you really were. I'm sorry we created an environment where you felt like you had to hide your success to protect our feelings. And I'm grateful, more grateful than I know how to express, that you finally got tired of protecting us and decided to save us instead." The simple acknowledgement hit harder than any business award or professional recognition ever could. For years, I'd been afraid that my family would resent my success or feel diminished by my achievements. Instead, Dad was expressing gratitude not just for the business transformation I'd facilitated, but for my willingness to stop managing their emotions and start sharing my actual capabilities. Marcus stood up next, raising his own glass with a smile that reminded me of the brother I'd grown up with, before we'd learned to be careful with each other's feelings. "To my sister," he said, "who taught me that real love means wanting the people you care about to be fully themselves, even when that's more complicated than the alternative. Sarah Chen, who'd become not just Marcus's wife but a genuine friend and collaborator in the hardware store's educational programs, added her own toast, and to a family that learned how to rebuild itself on honesty instead of protection. You've shown me what it looks like when people choose growth over comfort. But it was Mom who surprised me most with her contribution to the evening's reflections. She stood up slowly, her glass trembling slightly in her hands, and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Jessica," she said, "I need to tell you something I've never admitted out loud. When you were growing up, I was intimidated by how smart you were, how capable you seemed, how easily you solved problems that left the rest of us confused. And instead of being proud of that, instead of encouraging it, I think I sometimes tried to make you smaller so that I could feel useful as your mother." The admission hung in the air between us, raw and honest in a way that transformed the entire emotional landscape of our relationship. Mom had never acknowledged the subtle ways she'd discouraged my ambition or suggested that my confidence might be off-putting to others. She'd never admitted that her concerns about my intensity or my directness had been more about her own insecurities than about my actual well-being. "When you started hiding your success," she continued, "part of me was relieved because it meant I could go back to feeling like I was the one with wisdom to offer. But watching you these past 2 years, seeing you use your gifts openly and help so many people, has made me realize that my job as your mother was never to make you smaller. It was to help you become as large as your talents and your heart would allow." I felt tears I hadn't expected welling up in my eyes. This was the conversation I'd been afraid to have for 20 years, the acknowledgement of dynamics that had shaped my childhood and influenced every decision I'd made about hiding or revealing my capabilities. And instead of the conflict I'd imagined, Mom's honesty was creating space for a relationship based on who we actually were rather than who we'd been pretending to be. "Thank you," I said simply, "for saying that, and for being willing to change, and for loving me enough to want me to be fully myself." The dinner continued late into the evening, with conversations that ranged from Emma's plans to start a small business club at her school, to Dad's ideas for expanding the hardware store's consulting services to other family enterprises. It was the kind of planning session that had become natural for us, approaching family decisions with the same collaborative spirit we brought to business challenges. But the most significant conversation happened after the others had gone back to their hotel rooms, and Mom and I found ourselves alone in the quiet dining room, surrounded by the detritus of celebration and the comfortable silence that comes after difficult truths have been spoken. "I have something to tell you," Mom said, fidgeting with her napkin in a way that suggested she was nervous about whatever revelation was coming next. "Your father and I have been talking about retirement, about what we want to do with the years we have left, and we've made a decision that I wanted to share with you first." I waited, uncertain what direction this conversation might take, but prepared for whatever honesty she was ready to offer. "We want to travel," she said. "We want to see places we've always talked about but never prioritized because we were so focused on keeping the business running and the family together. And we want to do it while we're still healthy enough to enjoy it, while there's still time to have adventures instead of just memories." The announcement surprised me, not because they wanted to travel, but because it represented such a fundamental shift in how they thought about their lives and their relationship to work. Dad had always talked about the hardware store as his life's work, something he'd never willingly leave. Mom had always positioned herself as the family caretaker, the one whose job was to worry about everyone else's well-being. "That sounds wonderful," I said. "What changed your minds?" Mom smiled, and for a moment she looked younger than she had in years. "Watching you live your real life instead of the careful version you thought we needed to see. Seeing how much more joy and energy you have when you're not constantly editing yourself for our comfort. We realize that we've been doing the same thing in our own way, staying small and safe instead of embracing the possibilities that our success has created." It was another piece of the larger puzzle I was still assembling, the understanding of how deception and protection had shaped not just my choices but the entire family's approach to growth and change. My decision to hide my success had been part of a broader pattern of playing it safe, of choosing security over authenticity, of protecting existing relationships rather than risking the kind of growth that might transform them entirely. "What about the hardware store?" I asked. "Marcus and Sarah want to take it over completely," Mom said. "They have ideas for expanding the educational programs, maybe franchising the consulting approach to other communities. And honestly, knowing that you'll be available to help them navigate the strategic challenges makes it easier for us to step back and trust that our life's work will continue in good hands." The conversation continued past midnight, covering everything from travel plans to estate planning, to the ways our family had evolved since we'd started telling each other the truth about our dreams and capabilities. It was the kind of conversation I'd imagined having with them for years, the kind of honest planning that became possible when everyone involved was willing to be fully present instead of carefully managed. As I finally made my way back to my own hotel room, I reflected on how profoundly my understanding of family had changed. 2 years earlier, I'd thought love meant protecting people from uncomfortable truths and managing their emotions to prevent conflict. Now I understood that real love meant trusting people enough to share difficult realities, to offer authentic gifts rather than careful compromises, and to believe that relationships could grow stronger rather than weaker when they were built on truth instead of protection. The next morning brought a flurry of media interviews and follow-up meetings related to the award ceremony. Local television stations wanted to profile the family business consultant, who'd grown up in Riverside, and national publications were interested in the sustainable transformation model that had emerged from my work with Mitchell's Hardware. But the interview that mattered most was with Emma, who'd convinced her school newspaper advisor to let her write a feature article about her aunt's journey from hidden success to public recognition. She approached the conversation with the seriousness of a professional journalist, asking pointed questions about authenticity, courage, and the relationship between personal growth and professional achievement. "What do you think would have happened if Vanessa had never said what she said at the barbecue?" Emma asked, her notebook balanced on her knee, as we sat in my apartment overlooking the Portland skyline. It was a question I'd considered many times, the counterfactual that made me wonder whether I would have ever found the courage to stop hiding if that particular catalyst hadn't forced my hand. "I think I would have stayed invisible," I admitted. I was comfortable with the deception, even though it was exhausting. Sometimes we need something dramatic to happen before we're willing to make changes we know we should make. So in a weird way, you should be grateful to her. The question made me laugh, both because of its unexpected insight and because Emma had identified something I'd never quite articulated. I wouldn't say grateful exactly, but I do think her cruelty served a purpose she never intended. It forced me to confront the gap between who I was pretending to be and who I actually was. And that confrontation changed everything. Emma wrote that down carefully, then looked up at me with the expression she wore when she was processing something complex. "Do you think she knows what happened? Like, do you think she knows that her mean comment actually led to all the success and recognition?" I considered the question, thinking about what I knew of Vanessa's life since she'd left Riverside. According to the social media updates that occasionally filtered back through mutual acquaintances, she'd married her tech executive and was living in a Seattle suburb, posting carefully curated photos of her lifestyle and luxury purchases. There was no indication that she'd grown or changed or learned anything meaningful from the experience of discovering my true professional status. "I don't think she understands the connection," I said finally. "People like Vanessa tend to see the world in terms of individual transactions rather than larger patterns. She probably remembers the barbecue incident as an embarrassing mistake rather than a moment that revealed something important about her character." That's kind of sad, Emma said with the matter-of-fact compassion that children sometimes possess. She could have learned something important about not judging people, but instead she just learned to be more careful about who she's mean to. The observation was so accurate, it took my breath away. Emma had identified the essential difference between growth and self-protection, between learning from difficult experiences, and simply becoming more strategic about avoiding their consequences. It was wisdom that had taken me decades to develop, delivered by an 11-year-old who'd watched the adults around her navigate these challenges with varying degrees of success. As the afternoon wound down and Emma prepared to leave with her completed interview notes, she asked one final question that caught me completely off guard. "Aunt Jess, do you think you'll ever get married and have kids? Because I think you'd be a really good mom now that you're not afraid to be yourself." The question touched on something I'd been thinking about more frequently, as my life had stabilized around authenticity rather than careful management. The years of hiding my success had made romantic relationships complicated, requiring either deception or the kind of gradual revelation that tended to create trust issues. But living openly had created space for the possibility of relationships based on mutual respect and genuine knowledge rather than carefully edited versions of ourselves. "I think maybe," I said, "now that I'm not spending all my energy maintaining complicated lies, I have room for other kinds of relationships. We'll see what develops." Emma nodded approvingly and packed up her notebook with the satisfied expression of someone who'd gotten exactly the story she'd come for. "I think this is going to be my best article yet," she said, "and I think other kids need to hear about what happens when adults stop pretending and start being real." After she left, I spent the evening reviewing proposals from family businesses, seeking consulting services, each one representing another opportunity to apply the lessons I'd learned from my own transformation to help others navigate similar challenges. The work was more fulfilling than anything I'd done in my corporate consulting career, partly because it combined strategic analysis with genuine care for the people and communities involved. But as I prepared for bed that night, looking out at the Portland skyline that had become the backdrop for my authentic life, I realized that the most important transformation hadn't been professional or even familial. It had been personal, the slow and sometimes painful process of learning to love myself enough to let other people see who I actually was. The woman who had sat silently, while Vanessa Pierce mocked her supposed profession, no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood that authenticity isn't just about revealing your accomplishments or your income, but about having the courage to offer your real gifts, rather than edited versions designed to make other people comfortable. It had been a journey that required giving up the illusion of control, the carefully managed relationships that felt safe, but ultimately prevented real connection. It had meant risking the loss of people who preferred the fictional version of me to the complicated reality. But it had also opened up possibilities I'd never imagined, relationships based on mutual respect rather than protection, work that aligned with my deepest values rather than just my professional capabilities. The awards and recognition were gratifying, but they weren't the real measure of success. The real measure was the integration I felt between my professional achievements and my personal relationships, the way my work now served communities I cared about rather than just corporate bottom lines. The relationships with my family that were finally based on who we actually were, rather than who we thought we should be. As I fell asleep that night in my Portland apartment, surrounded by the life I'd finally allowed myself to live openly, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete alignment between who I was and how I was living. No more hiding, no more careful editing, no more protecting other people from the reality of my capabilities and ambitions. The transformation was complete, and it had created exactly what I'd always wanted, but never known how to achieve: a life where success and authenticity were the same thing. where professional achievement and personal relationships reinforced rather than competed with each other, where love meant being fully seen rather than carefully managed. The journey from that humiliating barbecue moment to this place of integration and recognition had taught me that the people who matter want to know who you actually are, not who you think they need you to be, and that the courage to be authentic, even when it's scary or uncomfortable, creates possibilities that careful deception can never offer. 5 years had passed since that pivotal barbecue, when Vanessa Pierce's cruel words had shattered the carefully constructed fiction of my humble existence. Now, standing in the boardroom of the newly established Mitchell Foundation for Family Business Sustainability, I watched Emma, 16 years old and poised beyond her years, present her research on economic resilience in rural communities to a room full of investors, policymakers, and business leaders. The foundation had grown from a simple idea into something that touched hundreds of family businesses across the Pacific Northwest and beyond. What started as individual consulting relationships had evolved into a comprehensive support system, offering everything from strategic planning and financial restructuring to leadership development and succession planning. We'd helped save over 200 family enterprises, preserving not just businesses but entire community ecosystems that depended on them. Emma's presentation was part of our annual Impact Summit, where we brought together all the stakeholders who made our work possible. She'd spent her junior year of high school conducting independent research on the ripple effects of family business success, documenting how a single thriving enterprise could support dozens of other local businesses and hundreds of jobs. Her findings were being cited by economists and policy researchers who were finally beginning to understand what we'd known intuitively from the beginning: that family businesses weren't just quaint relics of a simpler economic era, but crucial components of sustainable economic development. The data shows that communities with strong family business networks are more resilient during economic downturns, more innovative in developing solutions to local challenges, and more successful in retaining young people who might otherwise migrate to larger cities. Emma said, her voice carrying the confidence that came from thoroughly understanding her subject matter. My aunt's work has proven that investing in these businesses isn't just about preserving the past, it's about building a more sustainable future. I felt a familiar surge of pride watching her command the room with the same intensity I'd once hidden from my family. Emma had grown up understanding that success was something to be shared and leveraged for broader good rather than hidden or hoarded. She'd internalized lessons about authenticity and courage that I'd had to learn the hard way, and she was already applying those lessons in ways that impressed seasoned professionals twice her age. After her presentation, Emma found me in the lobby where I was greeting foundation donors and board members. "Aunt Jess," she said, pulling me aside with the urgency that indicated she had something important to share, "I just got an email from the admissions office at Stanford. I've been accepted to their business program with a full scholarship." The news hit me with a combination of pride and nostalgia so intense it was almost physical. Stanford was where I'd discovered my passion for strategic analysis and business transformation, where I'd first understood that I had capabilities that could serve purposes larger than just personal advancement. The idea that Emma would follow a similar path, but without the years of hiding and self-doubt that had characterized my own journey, felt like watching the next chapter of a story that had begun with my own painful awakening to authenticity. "That's incredible," I said, pulling her into a hug that felt like celebrating not just her achievement but the entire trajectory of growth and possibility that her acceptance represented. "Are you excited?" "I'm excited," she said. "But I'm also a little scared. I keep thinking about all the stories you've told me about learning to be yourself in professional settings, about the pressure to hide your capabilities to make other people comfortable. What if I face similar challenges? It was a question that revealed both wisdom and innocence, the understanding that success often comes with social complications combined with the hope that her generation might navigate those complications more skillfully than mine had. I considered how to answer in a way that honored both the genuine challenges she might face and the advantages she already possessed by starting her journey from a place of authenticity rather than deception. You might face similar pressures, I said finally, but you'll face them with something I didn't have when I was your age: a clear understanding of who you are and what you're capable of. You've grown up watching the adults around you learn to be authentic rather than careful, and that gives you a foundation I had to build for myself through trial and error. Emma nodded thoughtfully. I want to study sustainable business development, she said. I want to build on the work you've done with family enterprises, maybe expand it to include cooperatives and social enterprises, businesses that are designed from the beginning to serve community needs rather than just generate profits. The vision she was articulating was both ambitious and logical, the next evolution of the Foundation's mission applied to emerging business models that prioritized social and environmental impact alongside financial sustainability. It was exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach that the next generation would need to address challenges that were only beginning to become visible. That sounds like work the world desperately needs, I said. And it sounds like you're exactly the right person to do it. Later that evening, as the summit wound down and participants began making their way back to hotels and airports, I found myself in conversation with David Kellerman, who'd remained on the Foundation board even after stepping down as CEO of Apex Industries. We stood on the terrace of the conference center, looking out over the Portland skyline that had become the backdrop for so many pivotal moments in my journey toward authenticity. It's remarkable what you've built, David said, gesturing toward the conference rooms where Foundation staff were packing up materials from the day's sessions. When I first invited you to join the Apex board, I thought I was recruiting a talented consultant. I had no idea I was connecting with someone who would fundamentally reshape how we think about business sustainability and community development. His observation made me think about the unpredictable nature of growth and impact, the way that authentic self-expression could create ripple effects far beyond anything we initially imagined. The decision to stop hiding my capabilities had begun as a personal necessity, a response to the humiliation I'd experienced at that long-ago barbecue. But it had evolved into something much larger, a platform for advocating for business practices that served communities as well as shareholders. I think the Foundation exists because I finally learned to stop separating my professional capabilities from my personal values, I said. For years I used my skills to help corporations maximize profits without considering broader impacts. When I started working with family businesses, I discovered that success could be measured in ways that included community well-being and environmental sustainability. David nodded approvingly. The most effective leaders are the ones who integrate their personal missions with their professional expertise. You've proven that business transformation doesn't have to be extractive, that it can actually strengthen communities rather than disrupting them. As the conversation continued, I reflected on how dramatically my understanding of leadership had evolved. The woman who'd hidden her success to protect other people's comfort had been operating from a scarcity mindset, believing that her achievements somehow diminished others, or that visibility would create obligations she wasn't prepared to fulfill. The woman I'd become understood that authentic leadership meant using whatever platform you'd earned to create opportunities for others, to advocate for approaches that served broader purposes than individual advancement. The Foundation's work had attracted attention from business schools, government agencies, and international development organizations interested in replicating our model in other regions. We'd been invited to consult on rural economic development projects from Appalachia to rural Europe, adapting our approaches to different cultural contexts while maintaining the core principle that sustainable business transformation required understanding and honoring community relationships. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from the businesses we'd helped transform. Mitchell's Hardware and Garden Center had become a case study taught in business schools, but more importantly, it had become a template that dozens of other family enterprises had adapted to their own circumstances. The ripple effects of those transformations were visible in communities across the Pacific Northwest, where Main Street districts were thriving instead of struggling, where young people were choosing to stay and build careers rather than migrating to larger cities. As I prepared to leave the conference center that night, Emma appeared at my side with a final question that captured the essence of everything we'd built together over the past 5 years. "Aunt Jess," she said, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd never hidden your success in the first place? Like if you'd just been yourself from the beginning instead of having to learn authenticity the hard way?" It was a question that went to the heart of my journey, the counterfactual that made me wonder whether all the pain and deception had been necessary, or whether there might have been easier paths to the same destination. But as I considered her question, I realized that the struggles had been essential to developing the empathy and insight that now made my work effective. "I think the hiding was necessary," I said finally. "Not because it was the right thing to do, but because it taught me something crucial about the costs of inauthenticity. If I'd always been confident about my capabilities, I might never have understood how exhausting it is to constantly edit yourself for other people's comfort. And without that understanding, I couldn't help other people navigate similar challenges." Emma nodded with the satisfaction of someone who'd received an answer that made sense of complicated experiences. "So sometimes you have to learn what doesn't work before you can figure out what does work." "Exactly. And sometimes the people who end up being most helpful to others are the ones who've made the most mistakes themselves." As we walked together toward the parking garage, I reflected on the strange circularity of the journey that had brought me from that humiliating barbecue moment to this place of integration and impact. The cruelty that had initially devastated me had ultimately catalyzed a transformation that benefited not just my own life but hundreds of businesses and thousands of community members who depended on them. Vanessa Pierce's mockery had been intended to diminish me, to establish her social superiority by highlighting what she perceived as my professional inadequacy. Instead, it had forced me to confront the gap between my authentic capabilities and my carefully constructed public image, setting in motion a series of changes that had ultimately led to recognition, impact, and the kind of integrated life I'd never imagined possible. The woman who cleaned toilets had never existed, except in the stories I'd told, to protect myself from imaginary dangers. The woman who now led a foundation that strengthened communities and preserved economic diversity had been there all along, waiting for the courage to step fully into her own life. And that courage, it turned out, had been worth every uncomfortable moment it had required. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.